Hello, everyone, and welcome to our wonderful book talk series on reimagining the Latinx experience. We're very pleased to welcome today our speaker, Rocío Rosales. Before she gets started and I introduce her, I just wanted to acknowledge a few of the people who have made the series possible. One of them, of course, is my research assistant, Isabela Ordorica, and she is joining us today, and she will also be monitoring the chat function. So while I am going to get us started, and then Professor Rosales is really going to get into the meat of her wonderful book, at the end, we want to welcome questions from all of you. And Isabela will be monitoring the chat function and sharing your questions with Professor Rosales. I also wanted to acknowledge Robbie Kadri, Aaron Hebert, and Jillian, who also were participating at Jillian Henry, I'm sorry, in making this possible by getting the word out and putting together all of our announcements and scheduling everything with us. And we're very grateful for their support as well. And none of this would be possible without the support of Dean Song Richardson and the UCI School of Law, as well as Ajay Mehrotra and the American Bar Foundation. And now I wanted to get to the main event, which is Professor Rosales' presentation on her book, Fruteros, which I have here just for your enjoyment. Beautiful cover, by the way. And it is a discussion of street vending, illegality, and ethnic community in Los Angeles. I have to tell you, it's an absolutely wonderful read because you get into not only the kind of ways in which fruteros work together in getting their fruit salads out there on the street corners of Los Angeles, but also you learn about their personal lives and their struggles and their connections. You also learn about how those social networks create opportunity, but also circumscribe it through what Professor Rosales calls the ethnic cage. And for me as a law professor, it was so fascinating to see the role of law in circumscribing opportunity, and not just federal immigration law and the treatment of the undocumented, but also municipal ordinances and the ways that they dealt with entrepreneurship through street vending. So now let me just say a word about Professor Rosales. She is an assistant professor here in the Department of Sociology at UC Irvine. And before that, she was a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Comparative Immigration at the University of California, San Diego. She completed her PhD in sociology at UCLA, and I think this ethnography was part of that as I read the book, and I think you spent 6 years gathering all of the material for the book, so just an amazing accomplishment. Professor Rosales got her bachelor's degree in sociology, cum laude with a certificate in Latin American Studies at Princeton University. And this book was published by the University of California Press. So we've got lots of wonderful UC connections here. And now I want to turn it over to Professor Rosales to share her findings and very, very interesting and stimulating work.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I do want to share this screen because one of the best things of this project is that I can share a lot of really wonderful photographs. And so, is that working? Perfect. So today I'm talking to you about my book, Fruteros, Street Vending, Illegality in Ethnic Community in Los Angeles, which was published by UC Press just this past May. And as mentioned earlier, this project really began when I was a graduate student at UCLA. Many of us who are familiar with Los Angeles, driving through the cities, know how ubiquitous vendors in the city are, found in almost every neighborhood throughout the city, working class, affluent, along main corridors. And my initial interest in this group was rooted in their informal economic activity and their immigrant status. As a graduate student at UCLA, I began visiting vendors in West and Central LA to talk to them and to get a sense of their lives. Jesus was one of the first fruteros that I visited regularly and befriended. And when I first started to visit him, he was clearly perplexed by my presence. I asked too many questions and stood too close to him because his infrequent and soft-spoken responses were barely audible above the constant din of street traffic. When I met him in 2006, he was only 21 years old. He was slender, dark-skinned, with a wispy-haired mustache and goatee. He always kept his gaze down at the waist-level tray table where he prepared fruit. And oftentimes while talking, he would wipe a wet rag across the cutting board to busy his hands and give his downward gaze a purpose. Among the many conversations we first had when we met was this one. I asked him, "Do you work every day?" And he responded by saying, "I keep bank hours." He laughed at my puzzled face, and with his knife, he gestured towards the bank that he was standing in front of. He said he worked 6 days a week, reduced hours on Saturday, and was closed on Sunday. One day, after visiting his street corner for several months, I arrived and could not find him. Had I just missed him? Where had he gone? It was the middle of the day, and it was a Salvadoran parking lot attendant who answered all of my pressing questions. The health department had done a sweep. They had dumped Jesus's produce into large trash bags before taking away his push cart, and they had asked him to dump all his remaining ice on the sidewalk. Did they arrest him? I asked, thinking immediately that it could be related to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I was told that Jesus had been given a ticket and was picked up by some of his friends shortly after. I don't understand, I said, trying to make sense of all the details. The attendant simply shrugged and said bluntly, "It's illegal to be a street vendor." Now, at that point, early in my research, I had no sense of how crackdowns worked or how often they occurred. I was immediately full of questions. If vending was illegal, how did street vendors reconcile their occupations, public and conspicuous presence with an illicit activity's need to remain private and hidden? Was the money that vendors made sufficient to counterbalance these crackdowns? The questions I had that day only scratched the surface of the complicated relationships that street vendors have with the city. Yet what proved more interesting was the Paisano network that helped vendors withstand this and other assaults on their economic and social well-being. And it was a complicated web of social relationships between the Paisano or compatriot network that really captured my sociological imagination. So even though a vendor works alone on a street corner or sidewalk in Los Angeles, as you see in these pictures, he, because it is most often a man, is part of a large network of fruteros who are often also his paisanos or hometown associates. And in this way, he is not alone. So here you see a mapping of all the vendors that I spent time with throughout my 6 years in the field. And as you can tell, a lot of them are from a town that I call Dos Mundos in the Mexican state of Puebla. So underneath each of their names are their country, state, or city of origin. And so you can see that there's a concentration or there's an overrepresentation of fruit vendors from Dos Mundos in Puebla. One thing you might notice, or rather, one of the reasons for this concentration is really rooted in one person and one family. So Gerardo Garcia functioned in this network as both a labor recruiter and a coyote. So he, along with his family, were used or were helpful in both recruiting migrants from Dos Mundos to come into Los Angeles. And then once they arrived in Los Angeles and in setting up those migrants with work on the street. So fruit vending throughout my time in the field, and this particular type of fruit vending was dominated by poblanos, that is migrants from the state of Puebla. But towards the end of my time in the field, I was beginning to see many of these poblanos employ Central Americans, reflecting the new wave of immigrants who were coming into the city. The primary respondents in my study, that is those that I spent the most time with both on the street and in their homes, were Cristian, Carmen, Manuel, Gonzalo, and Jesus. And in this presentation, I'll focus a little bit on their specific stories. Now, street vending has a long history in the United States of having recently arrived immigrants, of employing recently arrived immigrants. The Library of Congress has thousands of images of street peddlers in turn of the century New York. And among the top subject headings for this visual repository is the term ethnic neighborhoods. Looking through these black and white images of peddlers in the Syrian Quarter, Little Italy, and Little Jerusalem, one is continuously reminded of the connection between immigrants and street vending. The overrepresentation of street vending in a modern day vendor membership organization called the Street Vendor Project is apparent once you visit that website. This organization provides legal representation and advocacy to street vendors in New York, and there is no comparable organization in LA currently. In LA, another major metropolis like New York that serves as an immigrant gateway, street vendors are also overrepresented among immigrants. In New York, however, you see about 20,000 street vendors who sell food, flowers, books, art. By comparison, in Los Angeles, there are an estimated 50,000 street vendors, of which 10,000 sell food products, and about 1,000 of them are fruteros, or fruit vendors of the type that I study in my book. And this informal count of 1,000 was made between the vendors and I, estimating how many vendors used the commissaries to store carts, and then how many vendors existed outside of that space in more informal settings in terms of storing their carts. Throughout my time in the field, though, despite these numbers, Los Angeles was the largest American city that prohibited street vending. This prohibition often resulted in the confiscation of product, of push carts, of fines and citations, and at times of arrest. Now, street vendors are subject to scrutiny, citation, and arrest based on laws and regulations from various city, county, and state agencies. And enforcement is carried out by the LAPD, the Department of Public Works, and the LA County Department of Public Health. In addition to this, many fruit vendors are also undocumented, and they're thus subject to federal immigration laws that prohibit their presence in the country. Now, why did I choose vendors? Throughout my time in the field, it was not uncommon to hear of vendors working on street corners as fruit vendors just days after arriving in the country. Working on the street like this is starting at the bottom, Christian explained, as on one of the many days we sat and waited for customers while watching people and cars go by. At the end of the workday, as I rode around town in a pickup truck with Christian and Carmen while hauling their push carts to the storage warehouse commissary, they would honk and nod at their fellow fruteros working on the street corners we passed. Carmen always followed each encounter with a quick description of the person for me. That guy works for Raul. He's been here a few weeks. And that one doesn't know how to hold a knife yet. He's new. And most often, he just got here. He's from Dos Mundos, which was the same hometown of Christian, Carmen's boyfriend. Although I did not select this population of workers, knowing they would be such recent arrivals in an occupation heavily networked with paisanos, these characteristics proved to be important when scrutinizing the impact of social networks. Now, my book focuses on these immigrant fruteros and tells a story of ethnic community in challenging times. It is an account of their lives as migrants, as workers, and most importantly, as members of an ethnic community. It's a story about immigrant adaptation among entrepreneurial newcomers in a hostile context of reception. Now, the presence of fruteros on street corners throughout the city represents a confluence of larger social and economic forces. They're labor migrants who have crossed international borders in search of improved economic opportunities. Because most of them are undocumented, they confront obstacles that prevent them from legally participating in the formal economy. But they are socially networked into the informal fruit vending occupation through these strong hometown ties. And these hometown or paisano ties come to define their work and their personal lives in very powerful and meaningful ways, but in a way that contradicts how migration scholars have typically conceptualized immigrant workers. Now, migration scholars have long documented how newcomers lean on their community of paisanos for assistance upon arrival. And these immigrant social networks and the social capital they provide to their members are important sources of support in the lives of newcomers. One classic and representative study of migrants and immigrant social networks is the seminal book, Return to Aztlán. In it, Doug Massey and his co-authors write, landless jornaleros, or laborers, from a town such as Chamitlán may be poor in financial resources, but they are wealthy in social capital, which they can readily convert into jobs and earnings in the United States. I remember reading this as a graduate student and thinking that it was a beautiful sentiment. And then throughout my fieldwork, I found that immigrant social networks were not only sources of support overflowing with social capital. These networks were also overwhelmed by the economic poverty of their members and by the hostile context of reception in which they existed. In addition to being a source of support, these networks facilitated co-ethnic exploitation. Now, my book tells many stories of stability and insecurity, of settlements and return migration, of ethnic solidarity and exploitation. But most importantly, it tells a story in which paisanaje can be a social safety net and an ethnic cage. And this is my book's central theoretical contribution, this concept of the ethnic cage. A popular ranchera song by the norteña group Los Tigres del Norte is called La Jaula de Oro. The song is narrated through the eyes of an undocumented immigrant who is painfully aware of the freedom that he has lost in coming to the US. Of what use is money, he sings, if I am a prisoner in this golden cage? The ethnic cage concept in this book is meant to echo this song's sentiments. It speaks to the struggle found in the dual nature of something and provides a useful way of understanding the harmony and conflict found in the ethnic community of Fruteros. For some, the ethnic cage is large, invisible, and functions to corral community while keeping threats at bay. For others, the ethnic cage is small, visible, and functions to confine that individual while that same community does harm. Yet, as I show throughout my book, the ethnic cage can serve multiple functions at different times for the same individual, because personal, social, and work relationships are dynamic. Now, the Mexican migrants in my study open doors to newcomers, both to offer help and to exploit. This is the ethnic cage. Newcomers are not turned away. Their paisanaje grants them entrance, but it does not guarantee benevolence. Like others before me who stumbled on unsavory aspects of immigrant life, this is not the story that I set out to record. Fieldwork across several years revealed how structural hardship inspired ingenuity among fruteros. But this ingenuity often helped and harmed fellow paisanos. And across the years, I saw both the promise and pain of community. Now, the positive functions of social networks, especially among newly arrived immigrants, has received a lot of scholarly attention over the years. Social networks ease entry into the country and reduce short-term costs of settlement. They also help perpetuate migration patterns and promote remittance practices. But a focus on the positive functions of networks flattens complex narratives. And the relationships between people are complicated and dynamic. It is unrealistic, I argue in my book, to assume that ties between individuals offer only benefits, especially when vulnerabilities related to context of reception, immigration status, class, and gender are present. The paisano social networks that I document are constantly changing. They offer different individuals within the network uneven benefits, and they can simultaneously be helpful and exploitative. And this is what the ethnic cage is meant to capture, this nuance. Now, for my fieldwork, I did 6 years of fieldwork among fruit vendors, almost from the beginning of my time in graduate school, from 2006 through 2012. Throughout that time, I conducted 22 in-depth interviews. Of those, 12 were vendors from those Mundos. And these are in-depth interviews that I conducted at several points throughout my 6 years in the field. I also worked as a vendor for 2 summers throughout this time, where I actually had worked a cart by myself or closely with another vendor. And then towards the end of my fieldwork, I also went to Mexico to interview the families of vendors and former vendors who had returned to Mexico to get a sense of what they had left behind or what had happened. And I conducted 15 of these interviews with former vendors and with family members, with wives, grandmothers, aunts, mothers, fathers of current vendors in Los Angeles. Now, there is a hierarchy in vending that exists. Newcomers with little capital enter the job as workers for a pushcart owner, and typically at the time receive a daily wage of between $40 and $60, which might include a lunch drop-off. Pushcarts cost between $800 and $2,000, and those vendors who are able to save money can one day buy and become an independent vendor. Vendors who save enough money might be able to buy a truck, buy their own pushcart, and work their way up. But precarity exists at every level. Because remember, because vending is illegal, pushcarts can be confiscated during citywide crackdowns. Because vendors are undocumented and often don't have the ability to own a vehicle or a driver's license at this point in time, vehicles could always be impounded if they got pulled over for driving without a license. So few of the vendors that I followed were able to work their way up from vendor worker all the way to employer. And those that did were beneficiaries of structural opportunities granted to them by things such as citizenship in the case of one person, or by their pre-migration status in Mexico. Now, throughout my time in the field, two sets of brothers were continuously at the top of this vending hierarchy. Gabriel, Benjamin, and Omar from the Garcia family, and Raul and Andres from the Martinez family consistently had the most pushcarts and vendor employees. The Garcia and Martinez brothers at the time were all in their 20s and early 30s. Now, the Garcia brothers had much more capital than other migrants when they arrived in LA because their father owned the only mill in Dos Mundos. The entire town of Dos Mundos depended on the mill to produce their dietary staple of corn tortillas. The Garcia brothers had a high socioeconomic status in Dos Mundos that they were able to transfer to Los Angeles and its migrant community when they became owners and bosses. Meanwhile, the Martinez brothers benefited from the citizenship of one of the brothers. Raul had a US citizenship. Although he was raised in the US and or born in the US and raised in Los Mundos, he didn't speak Spanish, he still had the benefits of his citizenship. He was able to drive his truck and have a state-issued driver's license. His citizenship generally decreased his vulnerability as a worker and diminished the legal violence that he was exposed to. Now, this legal violence is a concept termed by Cecilia Menjivar and Lacey Abrego. Andres Martinez benefited from his brother's citizenship by purchasing vehicles and certifying pushcarts in Raul's name. Now, as I tell this story, it's important to know that it was not only employers who had exploitative tendencies throughout the network. Various vendors had the potential to both help and hurt their fellow paisanos. I want to begin now with the story of Cristian and Reynaldo. Cristian's first job as a vendor was with Reynaldo, his cousin. When Cristian arrived in Los Angeles, the pushcart he was meant to work was confiscated by the health department. When Reynaldo finally acquired a pushcart, he employed Cristian without pay, stating that he was still making payments for the pushcart. As Cristian explained, he, Reynaldo, would feed us and let us live in his house, and in 2 weeks, he bought 2 carts and we began to work. But he didn't pay us because he was just starting up his business. He says he doesn't have the money to pay us. He tells us to give him a chance. Since he bought the carts, he said he wasn't going to pay us right away, but that we should help him and he would just let us live with him and feed us. But again, he didn't pay us. He just gave us food and a roof to sleep under. So we worked for him like this for about 2 months. We would work and we would have good sales at the spots where he took us. He had this other guy who managed money for him. And I don't know whether he took the money for himself or didn't keep the books straight, because we had good sales. We would sell a lot and we were putting out enough money to pay for those carts. In about 2 weeks, the carts paid for themselves, he said. put out enough money. But he said he didn't have money to pay us, that the fruit was expensive. So I told him, if you're not going to pay us, we're going to go. And he said, whatever suits you. But if you guys leave, then leave. I don't have money to pay you. But if you're leaving, I need you to pay me for the meals you've eaten and the months you've lived with me. Christian continued, well, then we told him, we don't have money to pay you because you haven't paid us. If you want us to pay you, you'll have to pay us. So he says, let's add up how much you guys owe me and how much I owe you. When I arrived in LA, he said he was going to pay us $50 a day. But during that argument, he said he would only pay us $40 a day. So we added up the amounts for 2 months. A month and a half, we worked for him at $40, and he subtracted the meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, months of rent. He charged us about $6 per meal, almost $20 a day for food. He subtracted rent at $150 a month, plus electricity and gas. In the end, he owed us about $1,600 or $2,000. And after he subtracted everything, he owed us $700. But even that, he never paid us. What's really interesting about this is after Christian told me this story, I asked him, did you ever get the money back? Did you ever find him? Who is this person? Because of course, Christian left that working occupation. And Christian just laughed and he said, he's my cousin. I see him all the time. And it was just this understanding that he got exploited. He had this really horrible experience upon arriving, and it was something that he had to walk away from, right? Knowing that it was his own cousin exploiting him for his labor. Now, the relationships among vendors are really complicated. Strong paisano ties among fruteros mean that the personal and professional often mix. Groups of men who work together often also live together. The few young women on the job often date the young men. And business deals can be facilitated because of the intimate details associates know about one another. So for example, Manuel in this chart was able to get a loan from Gloria because they were both from the same hometown. That knowledge of each other's families allowed Gloria to give Manuel income. Later, when Manuel owed over $5,000 to Gloria, she was never fearful that he wouldn't pay because she said, I know his grandmother. So this is the type of relationship that you see in the network. Strong ties between paisanos based on connections of various kinds, as employers, as roommates, as romantic partners, give this social network its vibrancy. These strong ties reverberate with feelings of trust, support, and solidarity. In a business enterprise based largely on various types of informal agreements, trust is essential. People often rely on what Charles Tilley has called interpersonal trust networks to carry out long-term crucial enterprises. These enmeshed relationships and trust networks, however, are compromised. When they're compromised, they can bring about devastating consequences. So I'm going to give you a story of how Christian, Carmen, Raul, and Andres entered into one of these very complicated relationships. In November 2007, Christian left Los Angeles to visit his parents in Dos Mundos. Christian was homesick, plain and simple, and his mother had threatened him with not answering his phone calls if he did not return for at least a short visit. And this is a fact that I verified years later when I visited Dos Mundos. Christian had saved enough money to live comfortably for a few months in Dos Mundos and wanted to leave LA before another health department crackdown hit or financial crisis befell the group, which might force him to tap into his savings. Christian's plan was to drive to the border with Raul in his pickup truck. Although Christian had paid for his truck and owned it in practice, it was Raul, the US citizen, who was the owner of the title of the truck. The plan was to have Raul drive the truck to Tijuana. They would make their way to Puebla. Christian's American-plated vehicle was allowed in Mexico for a maximum of 6 months, at which point the permit issued to the vehicle would expire. So Christian planned to stay in Dos Mundos for no more than 6 months. Raul, who accompanied him, would stay in Dos Mundos for a week, flying back to Los Angeles. Again, as a US citizen, Raul had more freedom to travel in and out of Mexico. At the time, Carmen, Christian's girlfriend, told me privately that she was concerned what she would do when Christian left. Although she was happy for him in his reunion with the family, his absence also presented many problems for her. She would lose her cohabitating romantic partner with whom she split the bedroom rent, and she would be losing her daily rides to her street corner in the pickup truck, as well as Christian's assistance loading and unloading the heavy pushcart. Before leaving, Christian asked his cousins, Raúl and Andrés, to look out for Carmen while he was away. A verbal agreement was made. Carmen would continue working as a vendor using Christian's pushcart, but would work as a part-time employee of Raúl and Andrés. She would get rides with them, pay them gas money, and work 1 week for them as an employee and 1 week for her as an independent vendor. Because Raúl was planning on staying in Los Mundos with Christian for a few days, Andrés agreed to give Carmen rides to her street corner and to help her load and unload her cart. During the 6 months that Christian was in Los Mundos, Carmen worked with Raúl and Andrés without any significant issues. However, an ongoing conversation that Carmen had with Christian was about the pickup's paperwork. Christian had looked everywhere in the truck for the title but could not find it. Christian surmised that Raúl had kept the paperwork, but he was not sure if it was intentional or not. When Carmen offered to ask Raúl about it, Christian told her to keep that information between them. Christian did not think it would be a productive conversation and didn't want to upset Raúl, especially in the weeks before he was preparing to return to Los Angeles. Raúl was crucial to Christian's plans of returning. Without his help, he would be unable to cross the truck back into the US. Not only did Raúl have US citizenship, but he was also the owner of the truck on paper. Border Patrol agents would not be suspicious of someone crossing the international border in their own vehicle. But if Raúl and Christian fought over the fact that Raúl took the paperwork, Raúl could rescind his offer to help take the truck back across the country, the international border. Mixed legal status among intimate partners, relatives, and friends can do much to structure relationships. The power dynamic between individuals is impacted by governmental policies that benefit some while exposing the vulnerabilities of others. In effect, these policies can sanction legal violence when legal rights, protections, and benefits are unevenly distributed in a process that creates what Daisy Del Real has called toxic ties between documented and undocumented individuals in the same network. Thus, even though Christian would characterize his relationship with Raúl as a strong friendship in addition to being a kinship tie, he was aware of the power differentials between them rooted in their different legal statuses. When Raúl finally flew to Puebla to help Christian make the journey back, he picked up Christian and Alejandro, a neighbor who was migrating to LA for the first time. Unfortunately, on their way to the Mexico-US border, they got into a severe accident that caused the pickup truck to roll over. Alejandro, who was sitting in the back seat, not wearing a seatbelt, died instantly. Christian and Raúl were badly injured. Raúl was transferred to a hospital in the US, and Christian remained behind in a hospital in Mexico. News of the incident reached the Frutero community quickly. Carmen was constantly on the phone with Christian's parents in Los Mundos. Andrés traveled to Arizona to see his brother and help bring him back to California. The Los Mundos community in LA collected money to give the Martinez family to help Raúl recover. Similar collections took place in Los Mundos for Christian. Carmen was devastated. She continued working with Andrés, sending money to Christian's family in Los Mundos. And after a few months, it became clear that Christian would no longer be coming to LA. He was in Los Mundos learning to walk away again. In Los Angeles, life continued for the Frutero community. About a year after the accident, Andrés began to fill the void that Christian left. Carmen and Andrés became romantically involved. However, Carmen continued to be in a long-distance relationship with Christian. Carmen did not confide in me initially, but on several occasions asked me to drive her to random locations, and because I did not have a car, she would lend me hers so that I could run errands. I did this several times before realizing the role I was playing in their trysts. So one afternoon, when I headed to Carmen's apartment after work to have dinner and hang out, she asked me to drop her off somewhere and keep her car until the next day. When I drove her to the street corner where she asked me to drop her off, we sat in the car and waited. Finally, a truck arrived and pulled out in front of us. That day it had been raining. While sitting in the driver's seat, I turned on the windshield wipers to get a better look at the car. When I noticed it was a black truck, I said, "That looks like Andres's truck." Carmen at the point flashed me a look that conveyed pity. She said, "It is his truck," and got out of the car, covered her arms from the rain, and ran to the bus stop where he was waiting to pick her up. Andres's house was the staging ground where Carmen would prepare her pushcart in the mornings and where she would store it in the evenings. Andres would drop her off on her corners every day, 5 days a week, and she spent more time with Andres than ever before, so a romantic relationship was not unusual. But Carmen had never broken up with Christian, and it was Christian who had asked Raul and Andres to watch out for Carmen while he was gone. My thought while I was sitting in that car was, this could get ugly, and it did. Raul found out about the affair between Carmen and Andres. Christian and Carmen talked on the phone and fought. Christian told Raul that he did not want Carmen working his pushcart any longer. He asked Raul to take away the pushcart as punishment, but both the Martinez brothers thought this was unwise and refused to do it. The Martinez brothers knew that Christian would not return to Los Angeles, and any claim he had on the pushcart was lost when he left. In talks with Carmen, they told her that Christian had asked what he had asked, and said that they were not going to enforce his cross-border punishment. They did not want to take away her livelihood. But mornings preparing the pushcart in the Martinez's backyard became strained. Raul and Andres fought often. Their wives eventually figured out what the fight was about and abruptly pulled the welcome mat out from Carmen's feet. In one swoop, Carmen lost access to the backyard storage space and to the daily transportation. She became persona non grata in the Martinez household and with the other fruteros that Raul and Andres worked with. Though Carmen was not of those Mundos transplant, she had been deeply invested in that Paisana community. For years, Carmen had prepared for this type of precarity by performing highly gendered scripts with other fruit vendors. Her interactions with male fruteros was structured in part by the precarious nature of the informal work and by her token status as a young woman in an occupation dominated by men. The risk associated with the job and the looming threat of health department crackdowns meant that a request for help was always around the corner. Carmen knew she needed to stay in the good graces of multiple fruit vendors in order to more readily request and receive help. As a young woman, she was often viewed as a potential romantic partner, and in an effort to receive assistance, she leveraged her token status and performed a highly gendered script of job flirt. She was always friendly and flirtatious, often stringing men along who promised to take her out on a date. When she was kicked out of the Martinez working group, she began dating a series of fruteros, trying to leverage a romantic relationship for continued access to the Dos Mundos community and assistance with storing and transporting her pushcart. In addition to this, she participated in weekly tandas with other community members, and this system of forced savings had been instrumental to help her save money for her to buy a used sedan, and later the goodwill and trust she had generated while participating in these tandas and in the community colectas, this pooling of monetary donations among community members, helped her maintain access to the community. Now, the strong ties between fruteros are apparent in the various ways that they relate to each other. They can be co-workers, business associates, roommates, and even romantic partners. While these connections add depth and meaning to their relationships, they also create more vulnerability, as seen with Carmen when her relationship with Raul, Andres, and Christian fell apart. Being romantically involved with a coworker might make the job easier by reducing living expenses, but a fallout means that more than losing a partner, it can also lead to the loss of livelihood. Now, I want to move on and talk a little bit about those mundos. I tried several times when I was in those mundos or throughout my time in Los Angeles, I tried to interview the Martinez and Garcia brothers with little help from them. When I visited those mundos, I tried to interview the parents of the Garcia brothers. And so I went to their home. I asked the parents of the Garcia brothers for an interview. I was invited in, given a Coke to drink. And then the parents quickly got on the phone with their children in Los Angeles. I was politely told that they could not talk to me, and I left. Later, while I was walking around town, Omar Garcia, one of the eldest brothers who had returned for a stint in Dos Mundos, approached me and told me, the thing is our business is our business, trying to explain why I had been denied an interview earlier in the day. Yet my visit to Dos Mundos showed me the power that the family had, both in terms of income and influence in the community. So here in this picture, you see in the blue, the flat roofed home of the Garcia parents, which is representative of other homes in Dos Mundos, 1 or 2 room homes with flat roofs. Now, the Garcias have property in the center of town, which is also on the hill. And next to the parents' homes, you see the beginnings of another home being built by the Garcia brothers. Immediately to the left, you see this 2-story home being built by one brother. Next to that home is this home being built by another brother. And next to that home is this home being built by another brother. Here in the center of town on a hill, you see the economic visualization of the Garcia brothers. While most homes in Dos Mundos are these flat-roomed 1 or 2 room dwellings, the homes that the Garcias were building were reminiscent more of those found in Los Angeles. Now, these structures conveyed success in and of themselves that also helped fuel out-migration from young people who wanted to experience similar success, without necessarily knowing that the Garcia's success was built partly on the exploitation of their own labor. Now, I visited Dos Mundos twice before writing my book, once in 2011 and then again in 2017. And the town had visibly changed due in large part to the remittances sent by the sons and daughters that it had sent abroad. A number of migrants had also fueled interest by local municipal governments interested in accessing those remittances. And here you see how a new road was built between 2011 and 2017. In addition to this, the elders left behind were also living a bit better. Here, a photograph of Manuel's grandmother, Doña Julieta, who at the time was waiting for me to finish getting rejected for an interview at the Garcia household. Doña Julieta's home and diet had improved considerably between 2011 and my second visit in 2017, as she reported to me. And as I said, across the years, this research allowed me to see both the promise and pain of community, the exploitation, the solidarity, the improvement of lives both in Los Angeles and in Dos Mundos of their family members. And I think this is what captures best the dual nature of the ethnic cage, of both the help and exploitation that exists for vendors in Los Angeles. And so this is just a very brief view into what the book is about. It's available everywhere if you'd like to purchase it. Thank you so much for coming to this talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosales, for that wonderful talk. And now, Isabella, we can go ahead and open it up for questions from the chat function. Please feel free to send your questions to the chat function so we can share them with Professor Rosales.
Thank you, Professor Rosales. I have one question so far, and I think it's in relation to the houses that we just saw. Someone asked, were they planning to support their parents and have them up their homes too?
I think most of the vendors have this idea of returning to Dos Mundos once they finish accomplishing what they want to accomplish. And I think this is a classic immigrant story where people leave their hometowns and go abroad with plans of returning once they've saved up enough money to buy a home or saved up enough money to pay whatever debt they have. And just like every other migrant story, this idea changes with time and leads to long-term settlements. So what you see happening now are vendors in Los Angeles who are building homes for themselves in Puebla that remain empty and with weeds growing, just as the Garcia Brothers homes, had weeds growing. I think everybody had plans. A lot of them are building homes very slowly because of the economic precarity, but few of them have actually returned to Dos Mundos. And so most of that money is being sent to family members left behind, to fuel infrastructure projects in those mundos, including the building of a plaza, of some public toilets, of they also use the money to pay a bus driver to basically function as public transportation in town. And so you do see improvements in town being fueled by the migrants, but you don't see the migrants themselves returning.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. This one says, is there any social/community sanction back in Dos Mundos when it is known that paisanos exploit paisanos?
So this was one of the most interesting things that I found. And one of the reasons why this exploitation continued was because many of the young men who were in Los Angeles facing this exploitation would often not want to tell their family members back home about what was happening. So Manuel, when he was being exploited by one of the Garcia brothers, wouldn't tell his grandmother that he wasn't getting paid or that he was being verbally abused on the job because he didn't want her to worry about him. And I think many of them didn't communicate this for various reasons, either because they didn't want their family in Dos Mundos to worry, because they thought that it was an individual fault that they were doing so poorly, even though it was often structural if things were confiscated. And so in not communicating to people in Dos Mundos about the exploitation, you didn't necessarily see people in Dos Mundos sanction their fellow neighbors. And so this lack of information also helped fuel more migration into Los Angeles from people in Dos Mundos who were largely ignorant of what was happening. Although there were whispers continuously about what was happening and why the Garcia brothers were doing so well, or the Martinez brothers were doing so well. I was largely surprised by how little communication there was about the struggles that vendors were experiencing in Los Angeles. And I think once I visited there, I realized, well, the vendors in Los Angeles want to protect their family in Mexico from all the things that they're experiencing and don't want them to worry more because there's already a big disconnect and a lack of communication. And so the reason for not communicating that exploitation became a little bit more clear once I went to those mundos and I talked to family there.
Thank you. Someone else asked, the Paisano network seemed to make upward mobility much easier for newcomers than it was for those who founded the networks. When newcomers take advantage of these networks, does it ever create envidia among the owners? For example, how dare you newcomers use my network as a stepping stone to become independent from me and ambition something more than being a frutero?
Yeah, there was definitely not envidia, but I think, or jealousy. The biggest issue that would often come up was that when vendor workers wanted to become independent, they had to find a corner that was profitable. And oftentimes the vendor bosses who employed them held on to those corners after they lost the worker. And so sometimes a worker, let's say Manuel, who had been working on his corner for a long time, working for a boss, he wanted to become independent and he wanted to work that corner because he had a regular base of customers. His boss at the time didn't allow him to keep his corner because in his boss's perspective, the corner belonged to him. And so corners, they seem like seemingly random locations, but oftentimes they're really strategic. They have to be close to a source where people have cash. So that's why they're often in front of banks. They also have to have really friendly people in the neighborhood who will provide them not only with clientele, but also access to a restroom, access to a trash can. And so the corners are highly negotiated locations with a lot riding on them. And when a vendor wants to become independent, they have to find their own corner, which is often really difficult in a city with limited access to all these very important strategic things. And so if and when a vendor did earn enough money to become independent, the fight wouldn't necessarily be over jealousy, it would be over space and location. And that was always a really big issue with people fighting for ownership of corners that were seen as very valuable.
Someone else asked, do you believe these stories apply to the people who sell flowers on the streets?
I think most often when I present my work, I'm intrigued by how people from other immigrant or ethnic communities and other occupations talk about the exploitation that happens between co-ethnics in those networks as well. And so I'm sure that there is some sort of this solidarity and exploitation that happens among other street vendor groups. I'd be interested to see if this specific group also has like a concentration of paisanos. Oftentimes you see paisanos not dominating niches because of this socially networked phenomenon. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there was a little bit of that. But I hope that somebody out there does their own sort of ethnographic study of this distinct vendor population.
Our next question is, if they had communicated the exploitation, do you believe that would have disrupted ties within the Dos Mundos community?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know that it would, simply because the Garcia family had a lot of power and influence. You know, by the time that I finished my fieldwork, they had 2 of the mills. So even if they continued the exploitative practices and the town was aware, I don't think that the rest of the town would have enough power or influence to do anything about it, because they also depended on that family for help financially to cross across the border. And one of the Garcia brothers was a coyote that helped facilitate the movement into the US. So it's really hard to fight against a family that like that has so much power and influence.
Thank you. Our next question is, were there any successful migrant stories of the Fruteros, or is that a question that would be answered by reading your book?
Well, definitely read the book, first of all. But there are very few stories. I think ultimately what I end up talking about are all the different ways that they can't succeed, all the structural ways. So you have local laws that police poverty that are among the most difficult to overcome. Then you have immigration law that sometimes would kick in. In the story, I tell the story of Manuel, who was pulled over for making an illegal U-turn in his neighborhood in South Central, and that arrest leading to an ICE hold. And so you have all these minor violations that can escalate very quickly because of their precarious status. And so more often than not in the book, I talk about the ways in which any upward mobility were quickly set back by all these different, because of all these different structural reasons.
Did you deliberately choose sociology over anthropology? Do you think the discipline of sociology is supportive of the work you want to do?
Yes. I mean, I chose sociology because it was the discipline that I saw myself most in as an undergraduate. At the time, a lot of anthropology was done abroad and not necessarily domestically. And so I became an ethnographer because I wanted to be like the ethnographers that I was reading. So at the time, it was Eli Anderson and Mitch Danier. And so sociology seemed to give me the tools that I wanted to use in the population that I wanted to study in a way that anthropology didn't. I don't know if I was defect, but I'm very happy in sociology.
What was your experience like while working the carts? How did the customers treat you?
I was treated very much the same. It was actually, I would be treated very much the same generally, but some Latinos would sometimes notice the different way that I would dress. So sometimes I would be on the street corner in Converse shoes, for example, or, like wearing something like with a New Yorker tote bag that I would keep aside. And so some more discriminating customers would notice these things and wonder. I know I had one instance where I was dressed really nicely and I had been standing next to the cart, just waiting as in the role of customer, like behind the cart, not working the cart, and the vendor had gone to the restroom. And so during this time, a random person approached the cart and asked me for fruit, but at that time I hadn't started working as a vendor. And I think the only reason that person, who was not Latino, asked me for fruit was because they saw a brown person standing next to a push cart and assumed that I was a vendor. So when I was asked, can you make me a fruit, at the time I was like, oh, the vendor's going to come back. And it was really awkward. And the person kind of, rightfully felt awkward themselves. But then years later, when I was actually working the cart as a vendor, holding a knife with gloves in my hand, I was approached by a person who was Latino, and they kind of hesitated to ask me for fruit because I looked, phenotypically a little bit different from the other vendors that they were used to approaching. So it was really interesting, like the sort of various ways that I was seen working on the street.
While we wait for more questions from the audience, I thought I would ask a quick question. You mentioned that Los Angeles was the large city with these very strict rules about street vending. Can you share with us why Los Angeles had such a restrictive set of ordinances about street vending? How did that come about?
I mean, the municipal law that prohibited street vending has been on the books since the early 1900s. And I think there was a little bit of movement in the 1980s to try to change the law after there had been some activism on the part of Central American vendors working in the MacArthur Park area. And I think that was the first time where activism on the part of vendors actually tried to shift this law. The activism in the 1980s resulted in the creation of vending districts. Only one of them really took off, and this was in the MacArthur Park area. But throughout the creation of these vending districts where vending would be allowed, a lot of outsiders, both in the form of city council members and local businesses, played a really big role in structuring like when those vending zones could operate, what could be sold within those vending zones, out of what type of push carts the people could, the vendors could sell. And so they almost over-regulated that so that it failed. I mean, street vending really benefits from being able to vend outside of normal working hours by like really quickly shifting your product depending on your customer's desire, by changing location if like one corner is more profitable than another. Beyond the 1980s, there was no other real major attempt to change the law. Later, or rather more recently, with the Los Angeles Street Vendor Association, you saw more activism and movement. And as I talk in the afterword of my book, beginning in this year, there was a law to legalize vending, mostly because of like the existential threat that the Trump administration posed to undocumented migrants. And so Los Angeles, seeing itself as a sanctuary city, tried to get ahead of that by creating policy that was a little bit more friendly towards undocumented immigrants in direct opposition to the Trump administration. And so in the afterword, I questioned why it took so long for the law to come into effect within the city and for the governor to support that law. Right now, we're at a standstill in terms of how it's going to impact vendors, because they're still working out how it'll be implemented to have vendors legally vend in the city. And so while we're talking about creating, while we're talking about making vending legal, the city is also talking about making the punishment for those vendors who don't get certification much worse than it is currently. So in the afterword, I talk about, a 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach, right? Which is often the case with policymaking and implementation.
Oh, it's just fascinating and really such a wonderful book. We're just about out of time, so I just want to recommend to everyone. You just got a little bit of a, no pun intended, taste of the project, but it's terrific, and it's so readable because of the stories, which are so compelling, and because you were fully embedded in the community, they really just come to life. I mean, I was just amazed by what you were able to learn from those 6 years of being so embedded in the community. So it's a very unique, I think, contribution to the literature. And we're very grateful to you, Professor Rosales, for sharing the work with us today, and in such an engaging and informative manner. I wanted to just briefly alert everybody to our next book talk in the series. We'll be hearing from Professor Gilberto Q. Conchas, who's going to be talking about the Chicana OX Dream on hope, resistance, and educational success. He has been working with a colleague on Latinx in higher education and their strategies, not only to persist, but to thrive in those environments. Interestingly, social networks also play an important role there. So there will be some interesting, I think, parallels and resonances in the two presentations. But just let's all thank you so much. We got lots of positive comments too, people thanking you. So we very, very much appreciate the time you've taken with us today. And we're grateful to our audience as well for the wonderful questions. Thanks so much.